Every headline called it a breakthrough. The king met Harry. Meghan was there. Archie and Lilibet were there. After years apart, the family sat down together at Highgrove. For a moment, the story seemed almost too perfect. A father and son, a grandfather and his grandchildren, a royal rift finally beginning to heal. But then one royal expert said the quiet part out loud. Maybe we are calling this reconciliation far too soon. Because a reunion is a moment. Reconciliation is a process. And the difference between those two words is the entire story. Yes, King Charles and Queen Camilla hosted Harry, Meghan, Archie and Lilibet at Highgrove. Yes, it was the first known meeting between Charles and the children in years. And yes, that matters. It would be strange to pretend it did not. A grandfather seeing his grandchildren after such a long separation is emotionally significant, whatever anyone thinks about the royal family. But emotionally significant is not the same thing as historically transformative. That is where the celebration starts to look a little premature. The headlines were written as if one private afternoon had solved a family conflict that has lasted for years. As if the past interviews, the documentary, the book, the accusations, the legal battles, and the silence between brothers had all somehow dissolved the moment the Sussexes arrived at Highgrove. But none of those things disappeared. They were simply not visible in the room. And that is the point. The public did not see the room. We did not see a photograph. We did not see a video. We did not see the family walking out together, smiling for the cameras. Buckingham Palace described it as a private family occasion, and no further details were released. That may have been exactly the right decision, but it also means the public knows almost nothing about what actually happened there. Was it warm? Was it awkward? Was it a brief courtesy? Was it the beginning of regular contact? Did anyone discuss the future? Did anyone mention William? Did Harry and Charles talk privately? Did Meghan and Camilla have a meaningful conversation? We do not know. And when we do not know, the temptation is to fill the silence with the version of the story we want to believe. If you wanted hope, Highgrove looked like hope. If you wanted proof that the family can still come together, there it was. But if you are asking whether this was real reconciliation, then you have to ask a harder question. What evidence would real reconciliation actually leave behind? Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams has argued that the real process remains a long way off. His point was not that the meeting meant nothing. His point was that the meeting on its own does not meet the standard for a repaired relationship. And honestly, that is a much more realistic way to look at it. A repaired relationship is not one meeting. It is not one carefully protected afternoon. It is not one set of headlines saying the family has turned a corner. A repaired relationship is repetition. It is another meeting, and then another one. It is trust surviving after the cameras move on. It is both sides agreeing that the private moment stays private. It is no competing versions of the same conversation appearing days later. It is no fresh public grievance undoing the goodwill that was built behind closed doors. That is why the privacy around Highgrove is so important. Not because secrecy proves something dramatic happened, but because privacy may be the only environment where this relationship has any chance of becoming less dramatic. Think about the pattern that has trapped this family for years. A moment of apparent warmth arrives. People begin talking about a breakthrough. Then a new interview, a new report, a new accusation, or a new dispute pulls everyone back into the old conflict. Hope rises. Then trust collapses. And every time that happens, the next attempt becomes harder. So when Fitzwilliams suggests that any future meeting needs to happen without a media circus, he is not just talking about royal etiquette. He is describing the basic condition for progress. No spectacle, no instant victory lap, No rushing to declare the feud over before anyone has had the chance to prove that it is changing. That is a difficult message to sell, because it is not as exciting as historic reunion. Historic reunion gives the audience a clean ending. It makes the story feel uplifting. It lets everyone believe that the family has finally found its way back to each other. But real family repair is almost never clean. It is uncomfortable. It is slow. It is full of boundaries. It often begins with people agreeing not to talk about what happened in the room. And that may be the most revealing detail of all. The Highgrove meeting was private, with no pictures and no official readout beyond confirmation that it took place. If this truly becomes the first step towards something bigger, then that silence may turn out to be a strength. But silence can also be ambiguous. A private meeting can mean trust is rebuilding. It can also mean that everyone involved knows the situation is still too fragile for public scrutiny. Those are very different things. So, before we call Highgrove a royal reset, it is worth slowing down. The family did meet. That is fact. The king did see his grandchildren. That is meaningful. But the claim that the rift is healed goes much further than the evidence we have. And the timing makes that gap between headlines and reality even more striking. Because this was not a calm, carefully choreographed royal visit that unfolded without a problem. It happened during a week already filled with tension, changing plans, security controversy, and a painful legal defeat for Harry. In other words, the warmest image of the visit may also have been the smallest part of it. And once you look at the rest of the week, the idea of a simple royal breakthrough becomes much harder to believe. That week was not a clean success story. Before the Highgrove meeting became the headline everyone remembered, Harry's trip to the UK had already been surrounded by uncertainty. There had been public discussion about security. There had been constant speculation over whether Meghan and the children would come at all. The arrangements around the visit seemed to shift in real time, while every possible decision was treated as a signal of either peace or conflict. Then came the legal loss. During the same trip, Harry lost a high court privacy case against the publisher of the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. It was a major moment, and not the kind of moment that simply disappears because a family meeting later takes place. That does not mean Harry could not have had a meaningful conversation with his father afterward. Of course he could have. People do not stop being sons, fathers, or grandfathers because they are having a difficult week in public. But it does mean the context matters. If you look only at Highgrove, the story is warm. If you look at the entire visit, it is much more complicated. There was the legal defeat. There was the long-running argument around security in the UK. There was the renewed focus on Harry and Meghan's relationship with the institution they left. And hanging over all of it was the question nobody could avoid. If this was truly a new beginning, why did everything around it still look so unstable? That is what Richard Fitzwilliams meant by calling the wider visit a mess. Not necessarily because the family meeting itself failed, not because the sight of Charles with Archie and Lilibet was unimportant, but because one quiet afternoon was being asked to carry the emotional weight of an entire week that had been anything but quiet. And that is not fair to the meeting. A family trying to rebuild trust needs room to breathe. It needs a little distance from legal drama, public argument, anonymous briefings, and the non-stop demand for proof that every gesture means something huge. But in the royal world, there is almost no room to breathe. The moment Harry landed in Britain, every movement became a clue. Would Meghan appear? Would the children come? Where would they stay? Would Charles meet them? Would William be involved? Would there be a photograph? Would someone speak afterward? The public wanted answers before the meeting had even happened. And then, once it did happen, the public wanted a conclusion. That is why this story became so easy to oversimplify. People wanted to choose between two versions, Either Highgrove was a historic reconciliation, or it was meaningless royal theater. But the truth may be less satisfying than either of those options. It could have been a real, emotional, important family encounter that still did not resolve the deeper conflict. In fact, that is probably the most sensible interpretation. For Charles, meeting Archie and Lilibet again was not just another diary entry. These are his grandchildren. They are growing up fast, far from Britain, far from the rhythms of royal life, and largely outside the day-to-day world of the family. For Harry, bringing his children to see their grandfather would also have been meaningful. Whatever tensions exist between him and the palace, he has spoken in the past about wanting his children to know their family and their heritage. And for Meghan, the decision to attend a private family occasion with the children would have carried its own weight. This was not a public balcony appearance. It was not a staged royal event. It was a visit to a family home, with all the history that comes with it.
So yes, the human side of this is real. But that is exactly why it deserves more honesty than the word breakthrough allows. Because when people are desperate for reconciliation, they sometimes confuse compassion with resolution. A father can want to see his son without every disagreement being healed. A grandfather can want to know his grandchildren without every question of trust being answered. A son can want a private moment with his father without suddenly being back inside the royal family. Those things can all be true at once. And this is where King Charles's age and health become part of the conversation, carefully, and without turning a private illness into a headline gimmick. Charles is 77 and has been receiving treatment for cancer. That reality does not prove why he agreed to the meeting. None of us can know exactly what was in his mind. It would be wrong to pretend otherwise. But it does make the timing emotionally understandable.
At a certain point, family arguments stop feeling theoretical. Time matters more. Grandchildren grow up, opportunities become less certain, and even when trust is damaged, people can still feel the pull of a moment they may not get back. That does not make Highgrove a reconciliation summit. It may simply make it a very human decision, a decision to see family while there is still time. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of the meeting, but it does not automatically change the political reality around it. The monarchy still has to protect itself. Harry still has his own grievances. The wider family still has its own boundaries. And the relationship between Harry and William remains a separate, unresolved problem. If you're enjoying a royal story that looks beyond the loudest headline, leave a like, because this is exactly where the real story begins. Not with whether the meeting happened, but with what happens after it. Will there be another visit? Will the next one be even quieter? Will everyone involved resist the temptation to explain, defend, or reinterpret it in public? That is the real test. And according to the expert's view, the test is very simple. If this family wants a future, they may have to learn how to keep the most important moments out of the headlines. But that is easier said than done, especially when this family has already lived through the same hope and disappointment cycle before. That is exactly why Fitzwilliams' condition for future progress matters so much. No interviews about the meeting, no public replay of private conversations, no attempt by either side to turn a family encounter into proof that they won the argument. At first, that may sound almost obvious. Why would anyone meet privately and then immediately discuss it in public? But in this story, that question goes to the heart of everything.
For years, the relationship between Harry and the royal family has been shaped not only by what happened behind closed doors, but by what later reached the public. Interviews, television appearances, books, briefings, responses to briefings, unnamed sources, and endless arguments over who said what to whom. That history has made trust incredibly expensive. And trust is not rebuilt by one emotional meeting. It is rebuilt when everyone involved proves that they can handle the next day differently.
That is the real challenge after Highgrove. Not whether Harry and Charles can sit in the same room. They just did. Not whether the king can see Archie and Lilibet. He just did. The challenge is whether the meeting can remain what it was meant to be, a private family moment, rather than raw material for the next public battle. To be clear, there is no reason to assume Harry, Meghan, or the palace will publicly reveal the details of this meeting. The fact that it has been kept private so far is significant, and it would be unfair to write the ending before anyone has made a move. But this is why the expert's warning has resonated. The family does not need another dramatic declaration. It needs uneventful consistency. That sounds boring. It is supposed to sound boring. Because boring is what stability looks like. A quiet arrival, a quiet meeting, a quiet departure. No dramatic quote the next morning. No mysterious insider offering a completely different version by the end of the week. No statement that turns a small step into another source of resentment. If that happens once, it is encouraging. If it happens again and again, then we can start using a bigger word than reunion. Until then, reconciliation is still a promise, not a fact. And this is not the first time the public has been told to see a meeting between Charles and Harry as a major turning point. In September 2025, Charles and Harry met after a long period apart. At the time, that meeting was also framed by many observers as a possible breakthrough. It seemed to open a door that had been closed for months. But the months that followed showed how fragile that door still was. Subsequent reporting described continuing tension around the meeting and around the wider effort to repair relations. Harry later spoke publicly about unnamed people whom he felt were obstructing reconciliation. Different outlets offered different explanations, and the full private reality remains known only to the people involved. But the larger pattern was impossible to miss. A hopeful meeting did not instantly create a stable relationship. The optimism arrived first. The complications arrived right behind it. That does not mean the September meeting was fake. It means that real progress can be reversible. It can be interrupted. It can be undermined by one badly timed comment, one disputed account, or one new conflict that reminds everyone why trust disappeared in the first place. Highgrove now faces the same risk. People saw the meeting and immediately wanted to know what it meant. But perhaps the wiser question is not what it meant on Friday afternoon. The wiser question is what it will still mean 3 months from now. Will Charles and Harry meet again? Will the children return? Will the arrangement become normal enough that it no longer needs to be called historic? And perhaps most importantly, will the relationship survive the next difficult moment? Because that is where reconciliation is tested. Not in the emotional high of a long-awaited reunion, but in the ordinary, frustrating, unglamorous days afterward. There is another reason to be careful with the word breakthrough. William is still outside this picture. There was no public indication that the Prince of Wales took part in the Highgrove meeting. There is no clear sign that this visit changed the relationship between the brothers. And that matters, because the conflict was never only between Harry and Charles, it was also between Harry and William. In some ways, those are two separate fractures. Charles is Harry's father. Age, health, shared history, and the desire to see grandchildren may create a path toward a limited, private relationship, even if many disagreements remain unresolved. William is Harry's brother, but he is also the future king. Their relationship carries a different kind of pressure. It includes childhood, loyalty, public duty, private hurt, and the unavoidable question of what happens when William becomes monarch. So even if Highgrove marks a thaw between Charles and Harry, it does not automatically touch the deepest divide in the family. That is why this was not a complete reunion of the royal family. It was a meeting between some members of it, an important distinction. And maybe that distinction is the most honest conclusion we can reach right now. Highgrove was not nothing.
It was not a photo opportunity because there were no public photos. It was not a meaningless gesture because the people involved chose to be there despite years of tension. But it was also not proof that the royal rift is over. The strongest version of this story is not the most dramatic one. It is the most patient one. Something may have begun at Highgrove, or it may have been a single, deeply personal family afternoon that will never become more than that. Both possibilities are still open. If you want to follow what changes after the headlines fade, subscribe. The real evidence will not be found in one triumphant announcement. It will be found in the next meeting, the next silence, and the next moment when this family has a chance either to protect trust or to break it again. And that leaves us with the only question that really matters. Was Highgrove the beginning of a long-term reconciliation? Or was it simply a rare moment of family warmth before everyone returned to the same old distance? Right now, nobody outside that family can honestly claim to know. And perhaps that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. Perhaps it is the story.